people around the country are really frustrated with barriers for them, feeling like their voice matters, feeling frustrated with the process. And I think primaries in many ways feel like just an example of that.
But what we do know is there have been many states that have sought to get rid of primaries. Every time they do this, voters put some sort of initiative on the ballot to put them back on.
I'm Julie Rose, and this is Top of Mind. I have been a radio journalist for 2 decades, but a few years ago, I found myself avoiding the news for long stretches because of how depressing and divisive it all seems. I still wanted to be informed and engaged on important issues, though, and I figured I couldn't be alone in that. So we created this podcast. Each week, we tackle one tough topic in a way that will challenge you, help you feel more empathy, and empower you to become a better citizen, a kinder neighbor, and a more effective advocate. Today, why do primary elections feel broken?
I consider myself a fiscal moderate and a social liberal.
Doug Goodman lives in Nevada. He started out as a Democrat, but switched in the late 70s.
I actually maintained my Republican registration until 2010. And at that point, I decided I just couldn't do it anymore. And so I made, to me, what was one of the hardest decisions I've ever had to make. And that was I registered as nonpartisan. And that's what we call independence in Nevada. And the reason I say it was probably one of the most difficult decisions is I knew what I was voluntarily giving up. Because Nevada is a closed primary state, which means you have to be registered as either a Democrat or Republican to vote in the primary. I was giving up my right to vote.
But you could still vote in the general election, so what are you really missing out on?
I'm missing out on the initial process, and also in most races, the primary election decides the race. We have some districts that are weighted towards one party or another, where there will be only one party candidates on the ballot.
So the party runs unopposed, basically. Yeah. The candidate they put forward in the general election is the winner.
And the percent of voters changing to nonpartisan or to minor parties is just growing exponentially in Nevada, to a point now where the largest segment of voters in this state are those registered nonpartisan. So now you've limited the number of people that are actually voting. And I say, I just can't accept it. So what can I do to change it?
Doug Goodman joined the movement to make Nevada's primary elections open to all registered voters. And after more than a decade, it's on the verge of success. As of early 2024, 11 states have active campaigns to move away from partisan primary elections. And they're motivated by a deep sense of frustration among voters that the way parties choose their nominees in high-stakes elections is broken. By the time most of us cast a ballot in a presidential primary, for example, it feels like a pointless exercise. Earlier states have already winnowed the field to a clear frontrunner. So naturally, many of us focus our attention on the general election, where showing up feels like it matters more. But here's the thing. If you set the presidential race aside, primary elections are where it's at. In 2020, over 80% of congressional seats were decided in the primary. A similar trend plays out in state legislative races all across the country. Because voting districts have been gerrymandered to favor one party so heavily, whoever wins that party's primary sails to victory in the general. And yet, turnout for primary elections is dismal, typically in the 15% range, compared to 60%, much higher for general elections. Why don't more of us vote in primaries? Well, because primaries happen at odd times, for one thing, and they seem to favor increasingly polarizing candidates. And in most states, you need the right political affiliation to even get a ballot. So today on Top of Mind, we are diving deep into primaries. And while I know that presidential primaries are top of mind at the moment in America, they actually function quite differently from primary elections for Congress, or state, or local office. The latter are more common and often more consequential. So non-presidential primaries are the focus of election reformers, and they're ours today, too.
Well, we've only had primaries since about the turn of the 20th century.
First off, it'll help to understand why primary elections work the way they do. For that, we have Rob Boatwright. He's a political science professor at Clark University and author of several books on the subject, including Reform and Retrenchment, A Century of Efforts to Fix Primary Elections. He says that prior to the 1900s in America,
political parties met in conventions and they chose their nominees. Voters had no say.
What prompted the change then?
So it was a reform that was championed by a lot of people connected to the progressive movement. These types of party choices were widely perceived as being corrupt. That party nominations could be bought for the right sum, or if you knew the right people, and that parties often chose people who were not qualified or were not appealing to the full electorate. So primaries were an innovation that first came about in Wisconsin was the first state to develop a statewide primary, but they were adopted fairly rapidly throughout the country over the next 20 years. It was sold as a way to break the power of big corporate interests, party bosses, and so on.
So that was the goal. But party bosses were not as upset as you'd expect.
For one thing, because parties still had a tremendous role in determining who made it to the ballot. And in many circumstances, parties could put all their resources behind one primary candidate. And, voters would vote, but they wouldn't really have a choice. The other important thing is that sometimes parties don't want to make a choice. Sometimes it is better for political parties to have the voters make the choice. To put this in the framework of today's politics. So I live in Massachusetts, which is a heavily Democratic state. Democratic primaries often involve 7 or 8 people. There might be, someone running who is of a particular racial minority. There might be a woman who's got support of a variety of women's groups and so on. The last thing party elites want to do is pick who comes out of that primary, because they're always going to make some parts of the party really, really angry. So parties, I think, at the time realized that they didn't have to make this decision. They didn't have to have people angry at the party elites unless they really felt like it was important for them to put a finger on the scale to choose the candidate they wanted. So because of that, I think parties went along with the direct primary.
And they're still going along with it. The details differ from state to state, but the thing to keep in mind is that while primary elections might look and feel like a general election, they've got polling places and voting machines and results announced on TV, they're fundamentally a party activity.
Primary rules are created by the political parties. In many states, parties control access.
But if voting is a constitutional right, how is it okay for a political party to pick and choose who votes in a primary election?
Parties are not mentioned anywhere in the United States Constitution. So what that means is that for much of American history, political parties have been treated as private organizations that can structure their choice of nominees in whatever way they want.
The U.S. Supreme Court has upheld that fact in a number of instances, based on the constitutional right of people and private organizations to freely choose who they associate with. The one caveat is that parties can't exclude people because of race, gender, or other factors protected by anti-discrimination laws. Oh, and another key thing to know is that the Constitution delegates most decisions about when and how elections happen to the states. And ever since direct primaries became the standard in the early 1900s, there has been tension between political parties and state officials over those details. Broadly speaking, there are 4 types of primaries.
There's the closed primary, which requires you to be registered as a member of the party in advance of the election. So whatever the state law is about voter registration, say 2 weeks, 3 weeks in advance of the election, you must be registered, and you must be registered as a Democrat, as a Republican, in order to vote for in either party's primary. That's used in a number of states, primarily eastern states. There's the semi-closed primary, which is you can show up and you can say, well, I would like to change my registration to a Republican.
On election day.
Yes.
Closed and semi-closed primaries are the most common. 29 states have them. The other 40% of states hold open primaries that also come in a few varieties.
There's what is called open to unaffiliated, which means that if you are a registered Democrat, you can vote in the Democratic primary. If you are unaffiliated with either party, you may show up and request a ballot of either party, but you're not subsequently registered in that party. You remain unaffiliated. And then there is the open primary, where anybody can show up. And there are two varieties of open primary. You can show up and just request either party's ballot. There's no accounting for which party you are a part of.
And then there's the nonpartisan top two primary. California and Washington both do this. So do Louisiana and Nebraska to some extent. Whereas in an open primary, you pick whichever party's ballot you want. With a nonpartisan top two primary, there's just one ballot listing all the candidates.
You can vote for whoever you want, and the top two candidates, irrespective of party, proceed to a general election.
So you could end up with two Republicans on the general ballot or two Democrats.
Yes.
Okay, and maybe you're thinking at this point, yeah, but what about the right to freely associate thing, where political parties get to choose their own nominees? Well, the courts have not definitively ruled on this, but so far, nonpartisan top two primaries have withstood challenge from political parties, particularly when it's implemented by a voter referendum to amend the state constitution. That's what happened in California and Washington. And in 2022, Alaska voters came on board with the latest twist. They have an open ballot, but the top four instead of two primary winners move on to the general election. And then, in the general, they use ranked choice voting to decide the winner.
So any number of candidates can compete in the primary. The top four finishers, regardless of party, emerge from the primary and proceed to the general election. And in the general election, voters rank the candidates and they hold a ranked choice election to figure out who is the ultimate general election winner. In the case of most recent Alaska elections, there were two Republicans running for the Senate who came out of the primary and proceeded to the general. And the same thing happened in the case of the U.S. House race.
And in that House race, the ranked choice system of tallying votes led to Alaskans electing a Democrat to a House seat for the first time in more than 50 years. This coming fall, 2024, Nevada voters are poised to join Alaska with a similar open primary where the top five finishers go to a ranked choice general election. So primary elections in the U.S. are a colorful patchwork. But Boatwright says they all have one thing in common.
Turnout in primaries is extremely low. It tends to run lower than 20% of the electorate. In some states, it can run as low as 3 or 4%. And what that means is you're getting the most committed, the most ideological voters, or you're getting people who are just kind of habitually vote no matter what. So we have very little evidence that open primaries substantially change the kinds of people who show up.
But if anyone can vote in a party's primary, why wouldn't more people with more diverse views turn out? Well, Clark University political scientist Rob Boatwright says, and spoiler alert here, the problem with primary elections isn't really how they operate, it's the system they're a part of. Boatwright will be back in a bit to make that case and pitch a solution. Next, though, let's head to Mississippi to see how even an open primary can still end up with low turnout and polarized results. Call it the Ballad of Nick Bain. I'm Julie Rose. This is Top of Mind. Hey, it's Julie, inviting you to embark on a whimsical journey with The Appleseed from the BYU Radio family of podcasts. Immerse yourself in captivating stories, expertly woven by talented storytellers. Join host Sam Payne and the live studio audience in laughter and delight as they explore a tapestry of tales. Tune in to The Appleseed for a family-friendly experience that sparks imagination and brings stories to life. It's your ticket to fun and creativity. Find The Appleseed wherever you listen to podcasts.
You always, like anything, think, could you have done more? Could you have went out there and done more? I'm Nick Bain. I am an attorney in Corinth, Mississippi. For the last 12 years, I served in the Mississippi House of Representatives.
Until 2023, when he fell to a newcomer in the Republican primary.
I only lost by like 26 votes.
26 votes. And did more than a decade of relatively easy re-election campaigns.
You know, you went from being pretty popular and coming off of an uncontested election, really, and the last election winning by almost 80% to getting a lot of vitriol and hate spilled your way on social media.
I mean, people accusing you of what?
Being a traitor to my race.
Nick Bain is part of a growing phenomenon in the U.S. of incumbents getting primaried by a fellow party member who often holds more extreme views. In the 2022 midterm elections, the number of U.S. House incumbents ousted in a primary reached a 20-year high. The story of Bain's defeat begins a few years earlier.
The biggest thing that beat me was my vote on a state flag.
In 2022, he joined a bipartisan majority of Mississippi lawmakers in removing the Confederate battle cross from the state's flag. He knew it was risky.
Short answer is it was the right thing to do, unquestionably the right thing to do. And I would rather lose my seat than be there 25 years and have voted to keep it. You know, I live in Alcorn County, which is a Civil War community, and I love that about it, and I respect that. But that's what I kept hearing all through the campaign was, you know, you voted to change the flag, despite the fact that, I was a co-author of the bill, helped write the bill that overturned Roe v. Wade. I had the CPAC endorsement. I had the NRA endorsement. I had all of these bona fide conservative endorsements. But what it boiled down to was simply the flag.
And low voter turnout. Just 5% of voters in Bain's district participated in the Republican primary. And he actually got 48% of the votes, which is more than either of his challengers who made the flag their top campaign issue. But in Mississippi, you need to get more than 50% to win outright. So they went to a runoff where even fewer voters turned out. And that's where Bain lost by 26 votes.
You know, I can count 30 people that I know didn't vote.
And the kicker here is that Mississippi has open primaries. People don't declare their party membership when they register to vote. You can vote in any party's primary, but you have to pick just one, which can still be a real barrier.
So I had family that voted in the Democrat primary because they had always voted Democrat. So
they were just stuck in their ways to some extent.
And they didn't understand the rules or the law, that you couldn't come back and vote 3 weeks later. I don't want anything to come off from me that sounds like sour grapes or anything like that, because that's not my purpose or anything at all. I do think that a primary such as Mississippi's has the potential to be disingenuous to the voters because you're trying to posture yourself as the most conservative or the most liberal person in the race, whether that's truly who you are. And there were a lot of common questions that I would get in my 12 years in the legislature, and one of the top 5 was always, please change our primary system. It was always one of the top 5 questions. Let me vote for the governor, Tate Reeves, and let me vote for my Democrat sheriff. I don't think that's fair to the voters.
What do you mean? To not allow them to do that?
Not to let them vote for who they want to vote for.
So put everybody on the same ballot somehow. So did you ever try to run a bill to do that?
I did not. No, I never did. I heard that a lot. And there was always a bill that was out there.
Do you recall ever having a chance to vote on a bill like that?
No, and that's probably one reason why I never filed it is because I knew it wasn't going to go anywhere. Both parties wouldn't. I mean, you had Democrats that were in charge in the Mississippi House until 2012. You never saw it. Now the Republicans are in charge, and you're now going to see it. So
why do you think that was?
Just protecting your kingdom.
Nick Bain is a former member of the Mississippi State House. Now, the fact that state lawmakers don't have much incentive to weaken the control their own parties have over primary elections helps to explain why nonpartisan primaries, where everyone's on the same ballot, typically come about through voter initiative. And Mississippi's primaries are already more open than most states. So let's look next at a state at the other end of the spectrum, where the dominant party holds a closed primary and filters candidates through a caucus convention system where party loyalists winnow the field before voters have their say.
And I think we do miss out on an entire segment of people who are your more mainstream, pragmatic, thoughtful, moderate Republicans.
Becky Edwards is a Republican who served 10 years in the Utah State Legislature.
From 2009 to 2018. And since that time, I've had the opportunity to run for both the U.S. Senate and in a special election for Congress. I've been through a lot of primary and general elections, we'll just put it that way, and had various outcomes on both sides.
It has been a roller coaster, frankly. And her experience illustrates a political shift over the last decade that's got so many voters frustrated with the way primaries often seem to favor the most loyal partisans.
it's on both sides. Both the extremes on the Republican and the Democratic side have kind of a magnetic pull that is discouraging for a lot of people. And it feels like party over principles, party over policies. And certainly the parties have a tremendous impact on what our elections look like, feel like, and eventually the ultimate outcome.
Becky Edwards' saga starts in 2008 when she set out to unseat a long-serving Republican in the Utah State House of Representatives.
It was the first time I'd run for office since high school, and it was a great opportunity for me to sit in living room after living room and spend, an hour or so talking to people about what my ideas were, but mostly learning from them. So this was only through the caucus convention system.
Utah is one of just a handful of states where party members choose delegates at neighborhood meetings, called caucuses, and those delegates go to a county or state convention and nominate a candidate to represent the party in the general election. So Becky Edwards didn't need to run an expensive campaign with signs and mailers to thousands of Republican voters. She just had to convince enough of the 125 convention delegates in her district.
So if you get 40% or more, you receive a place on the ballot. If you get 60% or more, you are the only party nominee. And we received 40.1%. And we received the opportunity to go to the primary by the vote of one delegate. And then we just worked our tail off in all of the old school ways that are really kind of the awesome parts of campaigning, knocking on doors, meeting with people, all of those things. And we had a small group of supporters and friends and neighbors and things that came together, and we ended up winning that race with a 4% margin. And I think it was very unexpected.
Especially since right from the start, Becky Edwards presented herself as someone who builds bridges, prioritizing action and community involvement over strict party loyalty.
It was interesting. My first election, I had part of a very conservative county and part of a more liberal county. And I remember doing a lot of voter registration in Salt Lake County and realizing that a lot of those folks were Democrats. And they had been kind of gerrymandered into this district in a very mostly conservative area. And they were not happy about it because they felt like their voice was especially not heard there. So I started to, say, listen, still get registered, go to your Democratic caucus. And the people started to say to me, you're advocating for democracy. You should be, just selling your own election here. And those folks ended up being very, very big advocates for me in the long run, because I started going to after I was elected, started going to their community council meetings. And they were a little bit uncertain at first. Why are you here? And I said, I'm just here because I'm your state representative. I want to know what's going on. I want to be a resource. And there was a lot of suspicion at the beginning. But after I kept at it for several months, pretty soon, my husband and I are dishing up snow cones at their community fairs and really being involved. And that was a very, very big win, I think, for the system in general and for civic engagement.
Once she squeaked out a win in that Republican primary, it was smooth sailing through the general election, because hers is one of the many districts nationwide so thoroughly dominated by one party that the primary decides the race. And even though she was unapologetically moderate in a system designed to reinforce party loyalty, Edwards kept winning. By her third re-election in 2012, she got enough delegate votes at the Republican convention to skip the primary entirely, straight to the general election and easy victory. The next cycle, 2014, she didn't even have a Republican challenger. But then, 2016.
When you're cropping a picture and then you can shift it to wherever on the original picture you can move the crop, I did feel like that there had been a cropping of the party, coming in smaller, and then just a shift that did not include all of me.
Political polarization was reaching a new level on the national stage. Die-hard Democrats and Republicans were moving toward the fringes of the ideological spectrum.
I had an opponent who was more conservative than myself.
And her trademark bipartisanship was becoming a liability. But Edwards doubled down on the relationships with Republican convention delegates she had spent years cultivating, and she managed to get 78% of their votes.
We had developed a real relationship of trust and appreciation for each other.
And that ought to have been enough to avoid a primary election. But a major change to the system in Utah had just kicked in. Citizens who'd been frustrated with the Republican Party's control over the primary system pressured the Utah legislature into creating a parallel pathway to the primary ballot. So now candidates could collect signatures to secure a spot rather than rely on delegates at convention, which is what Becky Edwards' conservative challenger did in 2016.
And I ended up winning that primary, but it kind of flipped the assumption on its head. And the assumption was that signature gathering path would help more moderate candidates. It would help people who couldn't make it through the real system, which was the caucus convention. And if you couldn't make it that way, here was another pathway.
Instead, collecting signatures became the backup plan for pretty much every candidate. The next time Edwards came up for re-election in 2018, she stepped aside.
I had always said that I would self-term limit and that 10 years was the time.
She left on a 2-year service mission to Samoa for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But she couldn't stay away from politics.
Came back in January of 2021, and I jumped into the race for the U.S. Senate.
Challenging incumbent Mike Lee, a vocal supporter of Donald Trump and an increasingly polarizing figure in Washington. Becky Edwards wanted to give Republicans an alternative.
Someone who's reflective of conservative principles, but a moderate tone that I believe really do match what the bulk of people in Utah want to see and what I believe the bulk of Americans want to see, this sort of large middle that is probably 80% of us who may have different ideas but really want to work with each other. And that, in my opinion, was not reflective of his work.
Edwards collected signatures as a backup path to the primary ballot, but she was still surprised at how poorly she did at the state Republican convention.
And that's sort of part of this story is that 2016, from very conservative delegates, I got 78%. Fast forward April of 2022, I went to that convention and got 11%.
What did you hear from the delegates when you talked to them? These people that you had known and had, who had supported you. Now you were up against an incumbent, clearly, but were they talking differently? Were they perceiving you differently at this point?
I think there was a different feeling with delegates. Even delegates that I had known from previous years were looking at issues and using words and phrases. And there was a lot more, you're not Republican enough, because here is what the Republican Party is today. In 2022, this is who we are. And Senator Lee represents that. And quite honestly, you don't anymore.
In the end, it wasn't even close. Senator Lee swept the Republican primary. And it wasn't because only the most ideological Republicans bothered to vote either. Turns out, turnout was over 40%, which is twice what's typical for primary elections. The next year, 2023, Becky Edwards collected signatures to get on the Republican primary ballot for a special election to fill a U.S. House seat in Utah. Again, she lost to the state Republican Party's preferred nominee, though the margin was closer. Now, Edwards might have done better if more unaffiliated voters and Democrats had switched and registered as Republicans to participate in that closed Republican primary. But she didn't explicitly encourage that during the campaign, she says.
It didn't feel like my role to go into a Democratic Party and say, I'd like you all to be Republicans now because this is the only way I can win. When they had their own candidates, they had their own down ticket races, it impacts sort of the shape and nature of our two-party system here in Utah, which I think we do well and better discussing issues when we have a strong dialogue in the public square, which necessitates both a strong two-party system and a strong, respectful voice that is diverse within the Republican Party and within the Democratic Party. And we just didn't do it.
In Utah, the Democratic Party lets unaffiliated voters participate in their primary election without becoming registered Democrats. The Republican Party only lets registered Republicans vote in their primary. And Edwards points out that in recent years, the Utah Republican Party has been moving up the deadline to register as a Republican. In presidential election years, Utah voters now have to make that switch in early January, a full 6 months before the primary elections happen.
Before we even know who the candidates are, who will be on the ballot, before we even know the issues that are going to be top of mind 6 months later, people will have had to have made that decision. I think that was a move in the wrong direction. There's always been fear that perhaps there will be hordes of people from one party coming over and changing their affiliation, and that they will really tip the outcome one way or the other, ultimately advantaging their party in the general election. What we've seen in Utah is that just is not happening. You don't have wholesale shifting of voters. For a lot of people, they're like, that is not who I am. And no amount of strategy, no amount of whatever is going to make registering with a party that I do not align with feel good. I just can't do it.
But you're still okay with the notion that the Republican Party would require you to register as a Republican in order to vote in their primary? You just would like to be able to see people make that choice a little closer to the election if they're a registered Democrat.
I think so. Over and over, what I've seen is that people around the country and here in Utah especially are really frustrated with what they see as being kind of gatekeeping or barriers for them, feeling like their voice matters in elections in general, feeling frustrated with the process. And I think primaries in many ways feel like just an example of that. They can feel exclusionary. They can feel like you have to jump through a lot of hoops in order to participate. And then if you don't jump through all those hoops or meet the deadlines or whatnot, then your voice is sort of not heard. And that's really frustrating, especially at a time when in our country we need participation because we have better outcomes and we have better type of dialogue when we do that. And at the end of the day, we do have a party system that has grown probably to be more powerful than I think we've ever seen it. And parties do have the responsibility to vet their own candidates and put forward the candidate they believe most closely reflects their principles, their values, and their ideas. To the extent that they can focus on that, I absolutely support parties in their nominating process and their convention process. But when it feels like insider game, that's, I think, when our system of democracy is less well off. And I would encourage parties to do as much as they can to reach out to encourage increased participation from a wide range of people within their party and make sure that they are intentional about encouraging that engagement, because I think that will be so important to the long-term viability of each party.
So you're not calling for let's take parties out of primaries, let's do an open primary, ranked choice voting, let's blow the whole thing up.
No, I'm not let's blow the whole thing up. I'm saying let's tidy up, let's fix our house. And I'll just speak as a Republican here, as Republicans, let's do better. We can do better. We have principles that I think are things that people can align with and support, but they're so buried underneath a lot of junk that really frustrates people. Even longtime Republicans are so frustrated right now and just yearning for something better. We've got the core. Let's just get back to it. Let's do better.
Becky Edwards, thank you so much for your time today. I really, really appreciate you taking time with us.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Becky Edwards is a former member of the Utah House of Representatives, and her current focus is a new political action committee that she's formed in Utah called Governing Group to help elect other candidates who share her pragmatic approach. Utah is one of about a dozen states right now with an active effort to get nonpartisan open primaries. Advocates in most states are taking the ballot initiative approach, aiming for a version of what California, Washington, Nebraska, or Alaska have. The state most likely to make the switch next is Nevada. Voters already approved an initiative to create a nonpartisan open primary in 2022. For it to be official, though, the initiative needs to pass a second time, coming up in November 2024.
I think we're going to win in November. People really understand and don't like the status quo anymore.
So why has it taken more than a decade to get there? That's next on Top of Mind. I'm Julie Rose. Hey, it's Julie. There is another podcast I think you're going to like from the BYU Radio family of podcasts, so I wanted to pass along the word. It's called In Good Faith. Join host Stephen Cat Perry as he connects with believers from various religions, Christians, Buddhists, Jews, Muslims, and much, much more. Listening to their captivating stories is an opportunity to deepen our own understanding of faith, religion, and spirituality. Plus, Stephen is really well-traveled, and his global perspective brings a unique richness to each conversation. Elevate your appreciation for the divine with In Good Faith. It's an inspiring journey of unity and enlightenment. Listen anywhere you get podcasts. Nevada's primary elections for the moment are completely closed. Government election officials run them with taxpayer dollars, and voters have to be registered with a party to vote in that party's primary. More recently, since 2021, voters have been allowed to switch party affiliation on Election Day and cast a ballot, but
most people don't do that. There's very little use of same-day voter registration.
Doug Goodman has been trying to get open primaries in Nevada ever since he walked away from both major parties back in 2010. We heard a bit of his story at the start of this episode. Back when he first started working on the issue, the open primaries movement hadn't really coalesced nationally.
I started looking around. What can I do? I mean, with this number of people just feeling abandoned by the parties.
At the same time, California and Washington were in the news for creating top 2 nonpartisan primaries. So Goodman thought, okay, maybe something like that. And he started calling his state lawmakers.
The idea I was pitching at the time was a top 3 nonpartisan open primary and ranked choice voting in the general. Everybody on the ballot, regardless of party, everybody votes, regardless of party, on the same ballot. The top 3, regardless of party, go to the general election. Then you use ranked choice voting in the general election, where you rank 1, 2, 3.
Now, adding this ranked choice piece onto the proposal went beyond the scope of Goodman's primary election concerns. In fact, it would be another decade before Alaska became the first to do ranked choice voting on a statewide level. But at the time that Goodman was getting his group, Nevadans for Election Reform, off the ground, back in 2013, a handful of cities around the country were experimenting with ranked choice voting. And it aligned with Goodman's desire to empower voters.
You don't have to ask yourself, oh, I really like this candidate, but they don't win, they can't win, so am I, voting for the other guy? No, you can vote your favorite candidate. Okay, who do I like next? Second choice. Who do I like third? Third choice. And with implementing ranked choice voting, it looks at, okay, let's look at first choice votes. It's like a normal vote. Does anybody have a majority? 50% plus 1. Yes. Election over. Done. No. Then it looks, okay, which candidate has the fewest first choice votes? Okay, it looks at that candidate and says, bye, you're done. If that was your first choice candidate, now who did you vote for second choice? And your vote is now reassigned to that candidate.
Oh, so as a voter whose first choice was maybe the least likely to win, but they're the candidate I liked the most, right? As a voter, I don't have to feel like I wasted my vote because I knew they were going to lose anyway, because now you're going to count my second choice. So I still have some say in the outcome.
Exactly. And in fact, the best quote about this situation, in 2008, voters in Santa Fe, New Mexico, approved using ranked choice voting in their city elections. Because of court challenges, it wasn't implemented until 2018. After the first election in 2018, Bill Richardson, former state governor, former UN ambassador, who was a Santa Fe resident, he was quoted as saying, I didn't quite understand what ranked choice voting was, but it was well explained. And even though my first choice didn't win, my third choice did, so I felt my vote still mattered.
So Doug Goodman started talking this proposal up to Nevada lawmakers and actually got a few of them to introduce a bill. It stalled. Same thing next session. And then when the Nevada legislature switched control from Republican to Democrat, same story. Goodman began to understand why state legislatures rarely move to make primary elections more open.
And it's power. They're in power. Their base keeps them in power, and they don't want to give up that power.
But then Nevada landed on the radar of national open primary advocates who brought the money and staff to get a nonpartisan primary initiative onto the 2022 ballot. Goodman thinks all the groundwork he laid in Nevada helped.
It's a constitutional amendment, so it has to pass the voters twice. It passed in 2022 with 53% of the vote. And this would actually implement a top 5 open primary and ranked choice voting in the general election. If it passes again, then in the 2025 session, the legislature will have to implement it. And then all statewide and federal elections will use this process in 2026.
What was the campaigning like? What kinds of interactions were you having with people when you were trying to encourage the voters of Nevada to say yes on this ballot initiative?
It was explaining the advantages. You know, how often do you go to the polls and hold your nose? You know, how about you've got most of the voters in Nevada cut out of the process? How do you feel about that? It's a tax money issue. Why should I, as a nonpartisan, pay for the internal operations of both parties? I often ask a party member, okay, you're a Republican. Do you like paying for the Democratic primary? I flip it around for a Democrat. Do you like paying for the Republican primary? No, you are. If you're paying for it, you should be able to participate in it.
So I can clearly see how you, as a disenfranchised voter, would feel empowered by this system. Would it really make that much difference to the outcome of the election, though? Or is the idea of open primaries and ranked choice voting really just to help voters feel better about their say?
You know, it may not make one bit of difference in the outcome, but it takes the partisan talking points out of it, makes candidates talk about issues, not talking points, because now you have to appeal to all the voters when you have all the candidates listed, regardless of party. I need everybody out there to get, if I want to make it to the top whatever, to get onto the general election ballot. I just can't talk to the 10, 15% of the party base.
And you think that would lead to better candidates, more likely to collaborate like you were talking about, more moderate?
No, it may not be more moderate. You know, they like to say, oh, this is going to be more moderate. That's been disproven. But it leads to more issue-focused campaigns, less negativity in campaigns.
So, but wouldn't that mean that if you had an open primary where any candidate could be on the ballot and try to win one of the top 2 or 3 slots, right? Wouldn't that mean candidates that had more money, more like richer, personally richer candidates that had a lot more donors or that were sort of more connected to a specific lobbyist group or issue, special interest group, or just people with more name recognition? It seems like they would have a much bigger advantage in an open primary than some upstart.
They do now. I mean, open primaries like this are not going to change, you know, our system overnight. It's not going to take the money out of politics. It's not going to take the media out of politics. It's not going to, you know, put the fairness doctrine back in or anything else like that. Yeah, those are nice ideals. Hopefully we could get there someday. So yeah, there are no guarantees is going to do that. Could a person with more money, more name recognition? Of course, they're going to have the upper hand. But it's going to let that candidate who maybe, you know, would be ignored otherwise, if they want to put the work in to get their name out there and become one of those candidates. The other interesting thing is when you look at this, you look at the diversity of candidates that are ending up going forward in this. I mean, you do. You have more women going forward. You have more racial minorities going forward, not only running, but advancing to the general election and winning. So does it guarantee more moderate candidates? Does it guarantee that, oh, we're going to end up with, you know, the rich guy who's got name recognition isn't going to do so well? No, it doesn't guarantee that. Can it make an impact in that? Yes. Can it make a candidate, a lesser-known candidate, more viable? Yes. For
it to work, though, for, you know, open primaries and ranked choice voting to actually make a difference, what else has to happen? What's on the voter at that point?
Voter education then becomes paramount. You know, after the campaign, now we're implementing. You've got an election you're going to be voting like this under. Then it becomes, this is what you're looking at. This is how easy it is. Get out there, the voter education part, that becomes paramount. So people don't, when they go to the polls, and are doing something different, doing something new, it's not this boogeyman, but hey, this is really good. And that's why when people go into the polls the first time and using this, they come out saying, yeah, I really like this. This was really easy. We are giving you so much more power than you didn't feel you had now. People like that idea. I can think and vote really, my conscience, vote what I want to. Oh, I like that.
But are you going to follow through on that? So yes, you like that you have more power. Now use it.
Definitely. So it is. It's convinced. It's showing the voter. I'm not going to say convince. It's showing the voter. This is how this benefits you. And buy-in's easy.
Doug Goodman, thank you so much for your time today. I've enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Doug Goodman is the founder of Nevadans for Election Reform. So here is what the research says about the effects of open primaries. Nonpartisan versions, where the top 2 or 3 move on to the general election, do appear to increase voter turnout by a couple of percentage points. But other factors, like whether there's a high-profile competitive race on the ballot, have a lot more influence on voter turnout than the format of the primary itself. As for polarization, there is no evidence that open primaries elect more moderate candidates. Anecdotally, there's evidence it can go either way. You can find open primaries where extreme partisans oust moderate incumbents. And there are examples of party insiders in very closed systems nominating a moderate candidate because it's their party's best chance of winning a competitive general election. Rob Boatwright, the political scientist from Clark University, basically wrote a whole book to disabuse people of the belief that changing how primaries work fixes, anything.
To take your example of incumbents getting primaried, right, of popular incumbents not being able to make it through their primary, my argument would be that that is in many ways a function of campaign finance laws, that it's possible today for an ideological interest group to selectively channel a huge amount of money into a primary, this kind of sleepy primary that has like 15 or 20% voter turnout, and effectively catch an incumbent off guard. That's really a problem with our campaign finance laws, not our primary system, but it's only been really a strategy for the past couple decades.
And on the issue of so many elections being decided in primaries with very low turnout.
That's not a problem with primary. That's a problem with the way districts are drawn, right? If districts are drawn so that they're heavily Republican or heavily Democratic, then that is a problem. But changing the primary law is not necessarily going to solve that.
In terms of making a general election more competitive, does that mean then that loosening the grip of the party, if you were to make it open, allow more unaffiliated voters or allow members of the other party to participate in that primary election, that still wouldn't solve the issue that you're describing there?
Right. In some ways it would make it worse.
Make it worse?
Well, so we have very little evidence that open primaries substantially change the kinds of people who show up. It takes a special kind of person to actually decide that they're going to vote in another party's primary, in large part because we tend to think about ourselves as Democrats or Republicans. Open primaries tend to sweep in a lot of people who are late deciders, right? And those folks are not necessarily not ideological. They're just people who get fired up at the last moment about a particular kind of candidate. And oftentimes the candidates who fire them up are candidates who are particularly extreme. So I don't know that opening primaries is the answer to this. Unlike general elections, primaries have a lot to do with competition. If there's not a competitive gubernatorial or Senate primary, for instance, many people just don't turn out to vote. If turnout goes up 5%, 10%, that might look like a lot, right? But you still have a tiny percentage of the overall electorate, and the people who are attracted to that primary may not be any more representative of the general electorate than the people who are already voting. So you haven't necessarily made your primary electorate any more representative. If there were a reform that could take us from, say, 20% turnout to 50 or 60% turnout, just the laws of statistics suggest that that is almost certain to be more representative. But changing from a closed to an open primary doesn't necessarily do that.
What kinds of reforms could make a difference?
Well, so I can give you a couple answers, right? I think that one important thing is for people to stop putting so much work into primary reforms. I worry a lot that the folks who are really strong advocates for open primaries, nonpartisan primaries, and so on, the energy that they're putting into that could be put into changes in campaign finance law, could be put into pushing states to adopt nonpartisan redistricting schemes. So the energy of reformers is a finite thing. And if you put it into causes that are not ultimately going to make a huge difference, you're wasting their energy, but you also risk demobilizing these people. So I think part of it is to spend less time agonizing over primaries. But if we were to reform primaries, the idea that I've been working a lot on is that a lot of the problems with primaries happen because they are sequential. So Texas, for instance, they're going to have their primaries the first week of March. We're going to have primaries spread all throughout the summer. The last primaries happen in September in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Delaware. If primaries were all held on the same day, I think they would get a lot more media attention. So you're there in Utah, maybe you don't have an exciting primary, but over in Colorado or somewhere else nearby, there is an exciting primary, and you kind of hear about this, right, from regional media sources and so on. So I think turnout would go up substantially if there were one day where all of the state primaries were held. I think it could be treated as sort of a civic holiday and so on. It could be treated as something for Americans to celebrate. And I think that would in turn make a difference in how legislators behaved, right? You would know that half the voters in your district were going to turn out in your primaries. You would campaign differently, you would behave differently, and you would just know what you were up against in your primary as opposed to basically just not knowing when your primary came along who was going to show up, what kind of people were going to be there. I think it would make primary turnout much more consistent. So there are all sorts of obstacles to making this happen, but we have a history in the United States of states banding together to create primaries that work for them. If you go back to the creation of Super Tuesday, for instance, in the presidential primary, the story there was Southern states wanted to drive up turnout to gather attention. So if states were to do this for their state primaries as well, or if there was some sort of national advocacy movement to try to get states to all consolidate their primaries, even if not everybody did it, right? If some states moved in that direction, I think it would increase turnout to the level that it would make primary voters more representative of the electorate.
Rob Boatwright is a professor of political science at Clark University, and his new book is Reform and Retrenchment, A Century of Efforts to Fix Primary Elections. This episode actually took me to a surprising place. I ended up registering with the dominant political party in my state and actually going to a primary election caucus just a few weeks ago. I never would have considered doing that before. I've always been pretty down on political parties. And I came into this episode expecting to find a straight line between closed primaries and the problems of low turnout and polarized politics. But that's not what the research shows. It's not what the experts we interviewed even said. Staying open to that information, that it wasn't entirely a problem of party control, was a real stick-with-it moment for me. And at some point, in sticking with all that discomfort, it dawned on me that I'd spent a lot of time complaining about political primaries and hoping that they'd change, but I never actually tried really engaging with the closed process. And so I did. And I don't know where this leads, but I am a lot more clear on how the process works now and where I might want to work for change. I'd love to hear if this or any other Top of Mind episode prompted a stick-with-it moment for you. Send us an email. Reach me at topofmind@byu.edu. Top of Mind is a BYU radio podcast. Today's episode was produced by Elena Beck, Samuel Benson, and me, with help from James Hoops and Sam Payne. We had sound design by Kelsey Ney, Brandon Lewis, and Trent Reimschissel. I'm Julie Rose. We'll talk soon.